The room had that official, borrowed smell hotels seem to gather after a decade of other people's lives. Faint bleach under floral carpet, microwave oil from long-ago dinners, and something sweeter, vanilla, like a candle someone left burning and forgot. Outside the window, snow feathered against the streetlight in slow, patient sheets. I remember thinking, as I shut the deadbolt, that the noise of the city felt oddly distant, softened the way an old wound does after years of not being asked about. Before I get into it, if you like true feeling stories like this, stick around until the end, hit subscribe, and give the video a like. It helps me keep telling them. I was in town for 12 hours, covering a shift I couldn't refuse. Night work had become my cheap penance and my paycheck. Shift trades, hotel rooms, orange coffee and styrofoam cups. I worked nights on the radio. Years at the tower make you believe the world is something you can measure by meters and voice. Altitudes, headings, runways clear. You learn to trust instruments you can't see. That faith is comforting until the instruments don't speak back, or worse, start saying things they shouldn't. My name's Mark. I was 36 then, pale from fluorescent lights, married to Lacey, father to Leo, who was 4, and slept with his knee pressed into the small hollow in my chest whenever I got home. This trip was supposed to be routine. Cover someone at the small regional airport, sleep, work, drive back, hug Leo until the smell of jet fuel left the seams of my clothes. Instead, the hotel room became a place where some old promise waited like a splinter under skin. I had grown up in this region, the kind of Midwestern town with a single diner, a cemetery of white stones set back from the road, and one oak that everyone called the wishing tree, because kids thought if you tied something to its branches, a wish might stick. The oak was on a little rise behind a farmhouse that had once belonged to the Cade family. Ruby Cade used to be the kind of friend whose name you still swallow with my teeth when you think of summers. She was not like the other kids. She had thin wrists and a laugh that made me laugh back without thinking. We were 12 the year she fell quiet. There's a way memory does its work in fragments. One scene and then another, like notes in an uneasy song. My version of what happened is scattered across those notes. Ruby and I promised once, under the oak, that we'd be on each other's side forever. A kid's promise maybe, but the kind that felt like a pact then, and has a way of weighing heavier as you get older. When she didn't come back from the creek one evening, I didn't run. I wasn't the one who ran. I watched her boots on the bank and then watched her go. And later, there were searchers and flashlights and yellow tape and finally a report. And then silence. People pointed to the Cade house, to Mr. Cade's temper. People pointed to me for being there and not doing enough. Blame is a communal thing in small towns. I was the sort of kid who didn't know how to argue with that kind of finger. The adults sorted what they could. The rest sat in my chest. So when my hotel door rattled and I heard the first soft, impossible knock that night, something old unfurled under my ribs. It was one knock that didn't belong to any person pacing the hallway. I had double-checked the deadbolt, the chain, the latch. They all clicked and felt solid under my fingers. But the knock came again, a careful, regular pressure, like someone testing the department store glass on a window. I stood with my hand still on the doorknob, the room dim except for the thin halo of light from the hallway. Hotel corridor bulbs always seem to have a nervous flicker, the kind that makes a dark shape longer than it should be. I put my eye to the peephole and saw the rectangle of carpet and the smear of a boot print right at the threshold. It was a winter boot, dark, rounded toe. Snow clung in a thin cake to its tread. There was no man in the hall, just the print, and then nothing. "Hello," I said, voice low, the way you use when you don't want to broadcast fear. My voice sounded strange in the room, echoing slightly off the TV and the miniature desk lamp. The knock came again, not at the door this time, but from inside the room itself, like pressure from the other side of plywood would. It was the same rhythm as human knocks, but the size of it suggested something taller, or something with long, deliberate hands. I wasn't alone in the world of strange radio noise. On bad nights at the tower, static folds into voices that might be the weather, or might be whatever was left behind by a storm. Over the years, I'd learned to separate the instrument's quirks from my own imagination. But this was the first time a hotel sound had wrapped around me with the same patience the oak tree had later in my memory. Quiet, certain, waiting. I live with a small knife in my travel kit, a stupid habit from the first time I had to break a car lock on a snowbank, and it felt somehow heroic. I kept it in the bottom of my bag, fingers finally finding the cheap plastic handle. I moved to the door and unhooked the chain. The instant the tiny brass link slipped free, the room seemed to breathe in, like the slatted plastic of the window fan inhaling cold. The light above the hallway shuddered and went out. My TV, tuned to static, pulsed as though listening. The air turned colder by a degree, sharp against the skin of my palms. Through the peephole, the hallway was a charcoal smear. Then, very close to the door, too close to the outer edge of the peephole view, I saw a shadow detach from the darker background, a shape that suggested shoulders and a head. The figure stood in a posture that made my stomach find the taste of iron. There was no face, only an impression, as if someone had smudged a photograph. Yet I felt, unmistakably, the weight of observation. Like being looked at through a microscope, like a fly pinned to a card. "Who's there?" I said, throat tight. Then, "Sir, do you need help?" Silence. No footsteps, no shuffling. The knock elsewhere then, a soft tapping at the inside door that vibrated up through the wood and into my teeth. I had the option to call the desk. I didn't. There are tiny acts where guilt and avoidance sketch their contours. If I called, I'd be admitting vulnerability. If I opened the door, I'd be doing something braver than I felt. The peel of snow on the sill and the thin vanilla smell were suddenly everywhere at once, layering into a nauseous reed in my nose. I pressed my ear to the door. Under the knock there was something else, a faint raspy inhale, like someone trying not to cough. And then, beneath that, an old laugh I thought I recognized. A high, childish chuckle that folded into the wood like a splinter. My heart did the thing it does when you remember a face you thought you'd forgotten. Ruby's laugh, only a breath longer than I would have sworn it should be. I backed away from the door and pulled the chair close to the deadbolt, as if distance could conjure safety. For a while I watched the darkness of the corridor through the peephole like an animal might watch the mouth of a cave. My rational brain composed all sorts of explanations: a prank, a man with a mental illness, a neighbor drunk enough to find the wrong room. The other half of me, the one that had been 12 and helpless, catalogued textures, snow on a boot, the weight of a laugh, and began to map them onto old pain. Outside, 2 doors down, a woman spoke into a phone in a low, irritated voice. On the far end of the hall, a cleaning cart squeaked. These sounds were normal and noise-proof. They could not explain the pattern of the knock coming from within my room, or the boot print that seemed pressed into the threshold like proof that someone had been on both sides of that door at once. I remembered the tree and Ruby again, and the stupid, childish promise. The memory isn't cinematic. It's a taste of cold in my tongue, and the feel of bark under my palms, and her hair falling into her face. We swore we'd never leave one another alone in the dark. At the time, it was a costume of courage that all kids wear. Later, it was a brand of guilt you learn to keep to yourself. I fetched my jacket and a flashlight. The beam was narrow and weak, showing only the pattern of the carpet and the door's brass numbers. Once again, the tapping started, a neat little tempo, the kind a person uses to claim attention. I considered calling the front desk. I thought of the police, the forms and reports, and the way small, weird things often get lost in the stack of serious emergencies. I thought, too, of the word suspicious and how petty it sounded. The decision not to call was less about bravery and more about protecting the version of myself that could still pass for normal. When I unlatched the door, I paused, because the latch, when freed, let a current of air through, carrying the exact smell that had been under the floral carpet all night: vanilla and cigarettes. The mix hit something in me that wasn't quite memory and wasn't quite smell. It was like being cleaved with recognition. The edge of the hallway light glowed weakly over a smear of salt-slick shoe prints. There was only one set. I stepped into the hall with the room light behind me and the flashlight's beam forward. The shoe prints led away the way any footprints would in hotel carpet. They vanished into the darker threshold beyond 2 doors down. No one was there. The corridor felt emptier and somehow louder, the way your skin registers when a distant animal's call makes the hair on your arms stand up. I followed them, felt the hollow of my shoe under the compression of carpet, the way the prints had a crisp, human direction. At the end of the hall, the stairwell door stood slightly ajar. Cold air breathed from it in a thin, metallic way that tasted like pipes and a distant road. The prints stopped at the threshold. There was a small, pale object on the top of the stairwell threshold. A child's shoe, one of those rubbery things with cartoon eyes. I hadn't seen anything like it since Leo was 2. My stomach knotted. The shoe was clean, almost new, except for a smear of dirt on the toe. I picked it up. The sole made a whisper of static in my palm. There was no blood, no gore. There did not need to be. The shoe fit the memory of a small foot, a laugh, tiny toes curled against cold. I realized then why the scent of vanilla had cut through me so clearly. It was the perfume Mrs. Cade wore, I thought. Or maybe it was the kind of scent you associate with old living rooms and candles and the idea of being taken care of. People in the past, I reminded myself, did not always match the roles you assigned them later. At the bottom of the stairwell, on a bench, someone had left a note, a strip of hotel stationery folded in careful quarters. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. In my handwriting, or at least my script, there was a single line: "You promised." I don't think I understood what the note meant at once. The phrase sat on my tongue like a name. My chest felt suddenly larger and smaller at once. I looked up and down the stairwell. The snow on the street below reflected the sodium light from the parking lot in such a way that all edges were softened. The hotel lot, usually full of cars, was sparse. One pickup truck idled at the far edge, driver inside, smoke curling into the glass like a small white ghost. I took the shoe and the note back to my room and locked the door with every mechanism the door offered. The radio in my bag hummed. My portable handset, the one I used for practice at the tower, lay in the corner with the antenna extended like a thin finger. Without thinking, I switched it on. Static. Then, faint and almost polite, a voice that could have been radio or hallucination said, "Mark." It wasn't a voice on any frequency I know how to read. It bent around the room like a draft. I told myself it was my name, said inside my head, fatigue speaking as best it could. But the voice felt hand-shaped, meant only for my name and for this room. "Who is this?" I asked aloud, ridiculous as the question sounded. The radio answered with a soft, breathy laugh. "You promised." I pressed my thumb into the note until the paper softened. How many small ways are there to tell yourself that leaving once is a pattern? The guy in the pickup truck pulled away. The hotel's neon sign hummed and threw its sickly blue at the snow. I called the front desk then, voice frayed, trying for steadiness. The woman at the desk was reassuring in that practiced, thick-lipped way hotel employees adopt. "Sir, we have no record of children in the stairwell. We do get lost toys." She offered to send someone up to check. I declined. There were practical steps I still could have taken. Phone the police, hand over the shoe, tell them the tapping and the voice. Instead, I wrapped the shoe in my jacket and put it in my bag, like a stolen thing. I told myself I would bring it to the station in the morning. It was a small moral declension, a single choice that slid my feet towards a place I would later call cowardice. The truth is, even then, I understood that shame is a narrower, more private thing than fear. You can be afraid and still want to protect the person you are. Night moved on. The knocking stopped. The radio returned to static. The elevator dinged twice and then went silent. I tried to sleep and failed. When you live with guilt, there are two kinds of nights. The ones where you are punished with dreams, and the ones where the punishment comes dressed as silence. This was the second. I woke around 3 to a scraping noise on the door. I sat up and watched the room, with all the caution I give instruments, trying to detect pattern. The hallway light had a new aperture, a single bulb humming brighter. The knock now wasn't the measured tap, but a slow, deliberate pressure along the wood, as if someone was moving their palm minutely along the grain. There was also the smell again, vanilla and cigarettes, but threaded through it was something else, the metallic, earthy note of damp soil and iron, like aftershave mixed with the smell of a wet field. I unlatched the chain and opened the door. There was no one in the corridor, just the print at the threshold and a smear of salt. Against the far wall, someone had pressed their palm and left a mark too faint to be anything but paint or residue. But, as I leaned closer, I realized it was finger-smudged dust, arranged in a deliberate ring. 3 little marks looping into one another like a child tracing a circle. Then I saw it. Beneath the edge of the stairwell, pressed into the rubber of the tread where a shoe had been, were tiny impressions in the pile, like the faint outline of small feet. They were too small to be mine, too precise to be random. I took a photograph on my phone, because shaking hands make for bad witnesses, and images are what detectives ask for when they are trying to make sense of a messy world. The picture came out grainy, the kind cameras make when they do not know whether to be honest or flattering. The tiny prints didn't resolve cleanly on the screen either, but they were there, in a way that made the back of my neck hot. I started to piece the night to the years. The prints in the stairwell reminded me of an old path through a hill behind an orchard where kids used to play. The smoke vanilla smell made the hollowness homework. There was the laugh and the note, the voice that said my name. I sat with it like a man counting weights. Each piece I handled with an anxious prudence, thinking perhaps if I arranged the facts in the right order, I could find a cause that would be both clear and acceptable. Instead, I began to feel like I had been invited into a rerun of something with me cast in a role I'd rehearsed poorly for a decade. I didn't call the police that night. I took the shoe, the photo, and the folded note and slid them into my inner jacket pocket, right next to my heart. I told myself I'd take them in with me when I walked out of the hotel in the morning. There was the practical worry. What would I tell them? How would I explain the knocking and the voice and the impossibility of that figure in the peephole? The more immediate reason wasn't practical at all. It was cowardice, and a hope that if I kept these things close, I could make them mean something else entirely. The next day at work, I tried to find rationality in radio waves. I record the frequency logs, monitor equipment, and make notes on anomalies. There are numbers attached to everything: signal strength, decibel rates, squelch thresholds. When a radio tries to talk to you, it leaves an indent of data. The logs showed an uptick in static interference around 3 a.m. from an unknown source. It was nothing the engineers hadn't seen before, ghost signals as we call them half-jokingly. The report went into a queue, and then another, the way bureaucracies eat oddness. A week later, there was a missing persons file from a county 2 towns over. It reached me because the sheriff's office asked for help, for the kind of local color you give when you used to be in the area. They sent details by email. A girl's name, Ruby Cade, found decades after her disappearance, remains identified via dental records. The message was clinical and sharp, something that should have sat in my inbox like many other things. Instead, it felt like a small, cold hand sliding between my ribs. I drove the hour to the coroner's office because the idea that I could PDF my way out of it made me nauseous. I sat in a room with beige walls and a stack of magazines older than me, and watched the deputy's mouth shape words I already knew. He apologized in that way professionals do when something is irreversible. He described protocols, chain of custody, evidence, preservation. The official language didn't help. I wanted the report to be different, clean, solvable. It was not. They told me the remains were found on a private lot, a place where Mr. Cade had once stored cut logs, and which had been sold and left to overgrow. The coroner's report said long-term environmental exposure and skeletal remains consistent with a juvenile female. Dental records matched. They would be releasing more details later. Guilt is not rational. It's a slow-release chemical. I sat in my car under the orange glow of the lot light and let it work on me. People in small towns talked. People file things away, then open them like drawers. Rumors had been a kind of soft remedy. Now there was a report. The sheriff's voice on the phone asked me about the night and about Mr. Cade. I told him everything I could remember and nothing I feared. I omitted the shoe and the notes and the voice that had said my name in a hotel room. After the coroner call, I should have turned myself in to the sheriff. I should have said, "Here are the places I was. Here are my memories and the holes I can't fill." Instead, I took a detour to the oak. Walking to the oak was a small sabotage against conscience. The tree stands farther back than memory wants to admit, along the edge of where the farmhouse used to be. The wind had been doing the same slow thing it does in late winter, swallowing sound and making everything feel like a memory. I stood with my palm flat to the trunk and searched in the bark. The knot where we used to hide notes was still there, rough and patient. I found a scrap of cloth, rotted but recognizable. Maybe the edge of a ribbon. I don't know why I kept touching it. I think I wanted to feel the continuity of who I had been. A kid who swore pacts and thought the world would remain full of small certainties. The oak had been a place of promises. That day, with the thawing sun, it felt like a ledger. There were people who remembered me as the boy who didn't run. There were people who remembered Ruby's laugh. I shouldn't have felt the man behind the door like a verdict, but I did. Memory and the present were circling each other like storm fronts. When I returned to town, I found an email from the hotel. They had called to tell me that a guest reported finding a child's shoe in the stairwell and had left it with the desk. They described the shoe exactly and asked whether I had checked out on the correct date. My name flagged in their system because I had used my airman membership to get a discount. The email was apologetic and then professional. They had attached a picture, grainy, the kind the hallway camera makes at night. In the photo, a dark figure stands in a doorway 2 doors down from mine. Its features were blurred because of the frame rate and the angle, but there it was, a shadow. My chest learned a new motion then, the small, habitual defense people learn when they are about to do something irreversible. I drove back to the hotel and stood with the night like a patient animal. There was an officer there when I arrived. His face was kind in the way officers are when they have seen how complicated fear can be. He took the shoe and asked me questions I answered with incorrect specificity, because the memory of things you avoid is not an archive, but a theater. "When did you first see the shoe?" he asked. "Last night," I said. "Did you touch it?" "Yes." "Do you understand you've compromised potential evidence?" he said. And in his voice I could hear both civic patience and the small disappointment people reserve for those who complicate straightforward processes. I tried to apologize, to explain about the knocking and the voice and the man behind the door in the peephole. He listened as officers will listen when they think the speaker might be in shock. He took my statement and filed it as possible misinterpretation and subject to corroboration. He didn't press the questions that mattered. That does something to you. The world keeps folding into official categories, and you are left somewhere between what you know and what you are permitted to claim. After that night, I stopped traveling. I quit the extra shifts and traded my midnight radio chatter for daytime monotony. I began, in small ways, to adjust my life to the idea that whatever had happened was a thing I would now need to carry and contort. Guilt makes narrow shoulders. Some nights, the scratches in my sleep were vivid. Cold hands at the door, a child's small shoe, a note that read, "You promised," in a handwriting that matched mine, because memory has a cruel economy. Months passed. The official story of Ruby's death took its procedural course. Mr. Cade had died years ago, they told me, a fact that didn't deliver any relief. The house sold and resold, as old things do.
The coroner's office released a statement about identification, and the sheriff's office closed the case with something called closure in the press release. People in town allowed themselves to think the ledger had been reconciled. I couldn't make the same allowance. Odd things would happen. My radio at home popped at 3 in the morning with a voice that sounded like someone clearing their throat. My son, Leo, began to insist that someone was at his window at night and would wake me, eyes huge in the dim, whispering, "Man at the door." We moved his bed so the headboard faced the wall.
For a while, there were nights I slept with the kettle on in the kitchen because the small hiss of water let me feel alive, near noise. I told Lacey about the hotel and the shoe after she found the folded note in my jacket while doing laundry. She looked at the handwriting, then at me, and her face wore an expression like someone trying to count a complicated debt. Lacey's way is to be practical first and moral later. "We should have given it to the police," she said. I nodded. What I didn't tell her was the truth I had been sitting on, the hole in me where my promise had been kept. The thing about guilt is that owning it often means dismantling the version of yourself someone else believes in. Not doing so is cowardice, but doing so can fracture families. She hugged me then and said, softly, "You did what you could, Mark." I lied and let her. For a while, we pretended the events were a small thing, something that could be contained between laundry loads and school pickup times. But ghosts, the ones that look like unfinished obligations, don't respect the schedule of daily life. They become a pattern, a metronome that ticks under the hum of fluorescent light. One night, months later, someone came to our house. I was alone. The knock at the door was not the polite hotel knock. It was long and patient, the kind you make when you know the person on the other side must come to terms. I peered through the peephole because old habits live in your skin. There was no one on the porch, no boot print on the step, nothing but the faint smear of salt on the concrete. The hallway smoke of the hotel, the vanilla, the child's shoe, the note, they had been seeds that found a way to take root. Now my son would call the night noises names that had nothing to do with childhood fantasy. "It's just outside," he'd say, as if speaking to someone else. He'd press his ear to the bedroom door and mimic the tapping he had heard, the tapping that had once invited me into the stairwell. It hurt in an animal way, that transfer of fear into someone else's voice. I started to see that life was now a negotiation with absence. I was learning how to live around the thing I hadn't been able to prevent, the slow erosion of responsibility into a shape that made me keep secret. The man behind the door became a kind of metonymy for all the ways I had failed to act decisively. He stood in the doorway of every moral choice I had ever made and asked the same little question, "What will you do now?" The radio would whisper. The hotel camera picture would reappear in my email months after, grainy and perpetual. People would say Ruby's name as if it closed the file. I would think of the oak's roots and the smell of the farmhouse and the note, and then I would go to bed and translate the knocking into a lullaby for a child who had a right to be safe. Once, midwinter, I went back to the stairwell and pressed my palm into the dust ring. My fingers met nothing. The ring wasn't there anymore, replaced by the fresh, clean stamp of a maintenance crew's footprint. The shoe was gone from the evidence locker the officers had procured, they told me, because of chain of custody confusion. I could not prove what I had seen. I could not prove what I heard. The sound of my son's name in the dark was the only evidence I could bring to bed with me, the only small comfort in a world that felt increasingly thin. There are nights when I walk by hotels and count the doors in my head like a man counting coins. I think, uncharitable and selfish, that the man behind the door was not only a figure but a threshold. To step through and own the past, or to stay where I was and become a person who keeps secrets wrapped in bland hotel towels. The moral is not that there was a ghost, or that Mr. Cade walked down cane-lined corridors. The truth is messier. Sometimes people who are flawed keep other people's losses, like hoarded things, and the weight of them changes the shape of everything. When I finally took the shoe to the sheriff's office, months after the photo, after the coroner's statement, after a life's worth of small refusals, the deputy looked at it and at me and then at the notes in his file. He made an expression I had come to know, the look of someone who sees the impossible and the mundane sit together. "We appreciate the follow-up," he said, and I saw in his face an understanding that people do what they can. He asked why I hadn't come sooner. I should have told him, the voice in my radio, the knock at the hotel door, the note I had written and then left folded in a pocket. Instead, I told him something clean and partial: fear and uncertainty, confusion, and the small hope that the shoe might mean there was some connection. He made a scanned copy, logged the item, and placed it in sealed plastic. It was official in the small antiseptic way the world makes its grief manageable. I left the building feeling less unmoored and more like a man who had given someone else a piece of his guilt to hold. It didn't make me feel absolved. It only changed the space the guilt could occupy. After that night, the tapping at my door reduced. The radio did not speak my name, except in the way static sometimes imitates the human voice. If there were apparitions, if there had been a man behind the door, he did not return in the obvious way. That should have been relief. Instead, it became a different kind of pressure, an intimate knowledge that fear can be contained by a law or an officer's log, but guilt is only ever tamed by action. I am not a heroic man. I am someone who learned to read instruments and lives now with the feeling that I misread the most important measurement of all: what a human being needs from another human being in the moment they need it most. The hotel room was a strange mirror. It let me see how small choices ripple. De guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: "The phantom knock, the child's shoe, the note in my pocket, these artifacts followed me like bookmarks." Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Contexto de continuidade. Fale com a mesma potência e força. Ready. The phantom knock, the child's shoe, the note in my pocket, these artifacts followed me like bookmarks. Sometimes, at home, when the house was quiet, and Lacey was asleep, and Leo's breath made the shape of a small cloud against the sheets, I would stand at the bedroom door and listen for the sound of someone standing behind it. I would test the deadbolt and feel the click like an old habit. I made vows in the dark, small ones. Tomorrow I will bring the shoe to the coroner. Tomorrow I will call and speak my whole truth. Tomorrow I will stand and act as though my hands are capable of honest service. But tomorrow is a fragile currency. There were nights I failed to keep promises to myself. Nights when I let the past remain a delicate, private thing that I kept protected because I was ashamed. On those nights, the knocking came soft and persistent, like a friend reminding you to keep a date. I began to understand the man behind the door, if he ever existed as anything other than a metaphor, for what he was, the personification of every moral decision I put off. I still drive by the Cade property sometimes. The oak looks smaller now, or maybe I am larger and the world has stiffened. The lot where the remains were found is overgrown and sleeps in the neutral way old things do, waiting for new owners to tend and name things again. People in town nod at me with a mix of pity and a secret they share with themselves. There is a hush to it, a recognition that we are all, in some measure, standing behind doors we are not yet prepared to open. Months turned to years. The hotel stayed the same. The man behind the door remained a question with its weight, never offering answers, but always letting me feel the shape of my own failures. Leo grows and makes promises the way children do. He ties ribbons to tree branches and shrugs when they fall. Lacey forgives me in ways only generous people do. She finds ways to fill the rooms with light. I carry the note in a drawer now, folded flat, the line, "You promised," pressed into the paper like a secret the house keeps for me. Sometimes, late at night, when the house hums with the refrigerator and the air is thin, I stand at the bedroom door and I listen. There is no knock. There is only the small life I succeeded in keeping, and the shadow of past mistakes. I made choices that night in a hotel that changed the shape of me. Maybe that is the only truth. That the man behind the door was never a single figure, but the sum of all my small refusals to act, every time I chose comfort over confrontation. I still wake sometimes with the taste of vanilla in my mouth, and I still keep a knife in the travel kit. But I have started to act in other ways. I volunteer at a search and rescue once a month now, the sort of thing that seems braver than it is. I tell people the story in fragments, softly, honestly, because secrecy does not help the dead and only preserves the living in isolation.
There are days when I want to apologize to people I cannot reach. Names in old newspapers, faces in grainy photographs. And then I remember that apology is not the only measure. A promise kept can be an apology lived. We planted a small memorial near the oak. It was not meant to be a monument. It was meant to be something modest and true. Leo insisted on choosing the flowers. He picked ones that smelled like the early summer porch and arranged them with serious concentration. People came. They stood and looked and put down stones and candles and sometimes nothing at all. A woman laid a hand on my shoulder and said simply, "Thank you for telling the truth when you did." She did not make it into a verdict. She did not offer absolution. She offered acknowledgement, which may be nearly as important. At night, sometimes, when the house breathes and the street is quiet, I sit by the bedroom door and listen. There is no man. There are only the small, honest sounds of a life in progress, a distant piano lesson, Leo's slow breathing, the hum of the refrigerator like a small, faithful beast. The knocking that used to wake me is now an occasional tap in the ribs of memory. I answer it by doing something concrete. In town, they still whisper some of it. Rumors have a soft life and a long shelf. The sheriff told me he would contact me if anything new came up. He has his job and the limitations of it, and I have mine. Being here, showing up, teaching my son that the world is not only made of people who fail, but also of people who try again. There are nights when I imagine the man behind the door as a composite of every person I might have been if I'd chosen differently. Braver, kinder, quicker. There are mornings when I feel like that person. Progress is uneven, made of small returns and small betrayals. I do not know whether that is penance or practice. If you stand behind many doors long enough, you learn to tell the difference between fear and prudence, between the sound of opportunity and the sound of excuse. The measure I carry now is daily, answering, keeping, showing up. I tell the story plainly when people ask, and when they don't ask, I sometimes tell it anyway, to empty my pockets of anything that could weigh down a future. Once, months after the memorial, I found a small ribbon stuck in the crook of the oak. It was faded and frayed, but not gone. I tied it to Leo's bike later that day. He rode slow in the driveway, and I watched him until the knot of anxiety in my chest loosened a little. There was no dramatic absolution waiting in the future, no sudden admittance of blame from another person, no neat resolution. There was only this: a child who believed that ribbons could mark a place for healing to begin, and a man who was learning, painfully and imperfectly, to keep the promises he had made him.